Okay, I want to keep working this exam question. So you're going to define what investment portfolio is, the 3 questions. So we're spending a lot of time on the what. Let's just real quickly. Well, first, someone give me the DC cuts eye that hasn't done it yet. Off the top of your head, without looking it up. All right, my sheet. All right, good. You're getting it. You see how just that by itself gives you some pretty good power for an exam question. You know, someone says, hey, you know, Fed's raising rates are rising. What does that make you think? Well, man, fixed income. This is a tough time for fixed income. Obviously, you want it to be short duration. Got to worry about you're going to be saying stuff a typical undergraduate student's not going to say. All right. And then what you got to do on each one of these is define subcategories, categories, and strategy. So who knows what's the definition of duration? It has to do with time. I'll give you it in letters. What is this? WATM. What is duration? So you said, I think you said, Barna, the M. What is the M?
Weighted average time.
Very good. Weighted average time to maturity using what? The discounted cash flows as the weights. And you can put the formula in there. Percentage change in a bond price is about minus duration times the change in yield. That's a formula. Everybody should know that formula. It's a very, very basic formula. Minus duration times the change in yield. Anybody remember the subcategories? There's 3 of them, if that helps. Short term. Pretty good. So what would you want to have had the last 3 months? Definitely short term, right? I saw an article today on why is gold down? Gold should be up this year. But the biggest headwind for gold is more than likely it's the US dollar. So you think, well, inflation's up, so gold should be up. But the US dollar, this is about the strongest I've ever seen a US dollar that I can remember. Maybe it was that strong when I was in middle school. I wasn't paying attention, but I mean, it's pretty amazing how strong the US dollar is right now. Gold doesn't like that. That's my guess. I didn't read the article because when I clicked on it, you had to subscribe to whatever Barron's or whatever it was. So I didn't get to read it. The 10-year is up to 557. Remember, in COVID, it got down to 0.5%. So we're up how many basis points since 2020? We went from 0.5% to 3.5%. How many basis points is that?
300.
I can't understand who was on the. Oh. 307, is that what he said? We're up 307 basis points. Is that a lot for 2 years? Yeah, that's a pretty significant rise in interest rates. Has it happened before? Well, it hasn't happened since 1980. 1994 was a really bad bond market, but interest rates rose 250 basis points to 75. Now that was in 1 year. We're talking about in 2 years here. But that's considered one of the worst bond markets in history, and that was like 250. So 350 is a pretty bad. So you hope you had short term, because if you had long term, you would have lost, if you had 10-year duration, you would have lost 35%. That's a pretty significant drop, unless you had convexity offsetting it. So convexity, you define subcategories in strategies. So strategy here, you expect rates to rise, you shorten duration and then expect rates to fall, you lengthen duration. Define convexity is that second order change in price given change in yields. So it's the change in the change. Subcategories are only two of them, positive and negative convexity bonds. These are the embedded option. Remember, negative convexity bonds must have some kind of embedded option that causes people to cause that negative convexity. And then the strategy, you expect rates to become more volatile. You buy convexity, buy bonds with high positive convexity. And if you're expecting less volatile rates, then you would sell convexity. That means you buy bonds with negative convexity, so you pick up that higher yield. You're all seeing how we just keep doing these categories: credit, probability of default, and consideration of sector. Subcategory, anybody remember the subcategories here? There's three of them again. What are the three categories here? High quality, medium quality, low or junk. And medium quality is essentially the triple Bs. High quality is AAA, AA, single A, medium quality, triple B, low junk bonds, that's double B and below. And then strategy, here we get a little more complicated. You expect a recession, move up on quality, and probably what? Lengthen duration. Probably. This next exam, when I write the tactical question, it's going to be a little tough, because people are worried about recession with inflation right now, that the Fed's going to have to keep raising rates even though we have a recession because inflation is too high. So that's going to be that unusual 1970 type of strategy. But I'll tell you on the exam. So if your boss doesn't tell you, I expect a recession, the norm is to say that, well, rate will probably fall. I think that's still true today, because we have a recession and we actually see it in the employment numbers. I do think you're going to see inflation pressures come off quite a bit. And how's Putin doing right now? Is he high-fiving anyone? So what happens to prices of natural gas and oil if Putin throws in the towel, or if he gets taken out? Could have a pretty big impact. I don't know what the Ukrainian wars have an impact, but for some reason I can't buy oatmeal at HEB. Is that because of Ukraine? Why is there no oatmeal? I mean, I have a really boring breakfast. Maybe I should switch my breakfast, but why can't I buy oatmeal? It's completely empty. So, what happens when Putin, I know, I don't know how long it's going to take them to rebuild Ukraine. I don't think the whole country is like devastated. I think we're somewhat exaggerating with the press. So they probably could get a lot of that working pretty fast. But who knows? We got a lot of things going on. You got President Xi coming up with a pretty big event. So there's a lot of events that could drive these kind of things. So is it possible we'll have a recession with inflation, with higher interest rates? That's possible. What do you do in that scenario? Boy, we struggle on that. We'll talk about commodities and real estate, maybe some things that would do kind of well in that environment, but it gets tough. All right. So y'all see you see this, the basic breakout, define what it is, what are subcategories, what's the strategy. Once we get down to these last there's not many strategies. Taxes is either got taxable bonds or tax exempt bonds. Structure, they're either structured debt or they're not structured debt. Inflation, they're either inflation linked or not. So it gets really pretty simple at the end. So these first three really are the most critical ones. Duration, convexity, and credit is where you spend most of your time as a bond investor. All right. Okay. So last time we finished up bonds and we're starting off with stocks. We're still on the introduction for stocks. So last class, we talked about how stocks have an expected return of whatever their current dividend yield is, which is really low right now in the stock market, plus expected earnings growth. We might adjust that dividend yield for stock buybacks. We'll talk about that for paper 3 and 4. But long term, that's what you're going to get. I try to prove that that's actually pretty accurate. The red line is that formula, dividend yield plus earnings growth. The blue line is the actual stock market. It follows that line pretty well until here recently, where really since the 2008 crisis, where stocks just look really expensive. They're either really expensive or they're, in my opinion, there's a one-time adjustment for risk. So you can kind of debate that. And then I said, well, if stocks are going to give you dividend yield plus earnings growth, how do we estimate earnings growth? Well, corporations can grow their earnings a lot faster than the economy without taking over the economy. So I showed you a chart that shows that corporate earnings here recently have been right in line with economic growth. Economic growth has been 6.47%. This is back to 1950. Corporate earnings growth has been 6.41%. But you notice most of the time corporate earnings growth was slower than the economy. And I argue that could be because I'm looking at the S&P 500 here. It could be that a lot of the growth in corporate earnings is coming from small companies and companies that don't exist yet. And so that makes up the difference. But as of just here recently, corporate earnings growth has actually been right in line with the economy. But does this chart give you any evidence that you should assume corporate earnings to be a lot faster than the economy? That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? You don't have much evidence for that. So if you expect our economy to grow at a certain rate, then you expect something similar for corporate earnings growth. And so then we got to this one. So here's what we got last time. How does our economy grow? I break it into 3 pieces. I know there's 4 pieces. I'm ignoring imports, exports, but I'm just looking at inflation, labor, and productivity. This is what you're going to have to put down for your paper 3 and paper 4 is what do you expect corporate earnings growth to be, which starts with what do you expect the economy is going to be. So historically, productivity has been anywhere from 2 to 3%, even lower, 1.5 to 3%. This last decade, which is horrible productivity, 1% productivity growth. Just amazing. Why is it so slow? So remember, I should find that article from President Obama. It's a really interesting article. I don't know if he wrote it or not. Presidents have a lot of writers that do stuff for them. So I'm sure he looked at what was in there before it was published because The Economist is a very well-known publication. But yeah, his main focus is why is productivity so weak? Not just in the United States, but in Europe and UK. So what do you think productivity is going to be going forward? And a lot of people say, well, we got artificial intelligence, we got nanotechnology, we've got virtual reality, autonomous vehicles, we got all this energy coming in that could be earth-shattering, battery storage, that could be earth-shattering. I kept reading these articles about the 1 million mile battery. Y'all have seen that? The Tesla car with the 1 million mile, that'd be pretty exciting. If we saw that, that would have a big impact. So why isn't productivity just massive? We have the internet, all this stuff that's productivity should be really, really high. And some people think productivity is actually not correctly calculated. AAA, I think you're the one that said, I wrote productivity wrong. So it's the real change in the economy versus the real change in hours worked. So it's the change versus the change. Is it possible we're calculating these numbers incorrectly? If it's the economic side, are there parts of the economy that we're not counting that are really huge? If it's the labor side, is there labor hours that we're counting that we shouldn't count or whatever? It's hard to just really say what's missing in these numbers. If you listen to Masters in Business, that podcast, he constantly says he thinks productivity is miscalculated, that it's really a lot stronger. Who knows? It's an estimate. So who knows? One of the numbers would have to be wrong, hours worked or the economy. It's possible the economy could be it. I know it was it Ethiopia or Nigeria or maybe Kenya? I forget. One country in Africa decided they needed to start counting certain parts of the economy they weren't counting, and suddenly their economy doubled like overnight, just by how they calculated things differently. So the calculations can be huge. The other argument is, and this is my argument, so I'll give you my argument. I think productivity is actually quite weak in the United States. And the reason I argue that is we got manufacturing. Manufacturing has gotten massively more productive in the United States. We're building a whole lot more with fewer people. I was looking at the numbers. I wish I had them for steel. How many tons of steel we're producing versus how many workers, and it's amazing how much more steel we're producing with so fewer workers. Auto manufacturing, much more efficient. But manufacturing is only like 20% of our economy. We got 80% that's service. And how is service doing? Well, there's two parts of the service economy that are horrible with productivity. Anybody want to guess? I think we talked some after class last time. What's the two least productive parts of our economy? You're sitting in one of them. Education, and what's the other one? Healthcare. Horrible productivity. Education is just amazing how many workers, colleges, and schools are hiring, and no one knows where they're working. We don't know where these people are. Public schools are hiring massive numbers of people, and they're not in the classroom. We don't know what these people are doing. They're doing something, but when you look at the number of students versus the number of workers, public schools have gotten terribly inefficient. Universities even worse. We have no clue where we're hiring these people. We don't know what they're doing. They're not in the classroom. They're doing something. Do y'all notice them? Y'all all have like your own butler that's following you around campus and helping you. You have advisors. How much of their time do you use? Are you talking to them every week? Are they helping you? I had an advisor when I was in school. So who are these people? What are they doing? But we're spending a fortune on personnel and education without really knowing what they're doing. They may be doing a lot. I saw one guy did an analysis of a college, all these new college workers, and his final assessment is they meet, and when they meet, they review the minutes from the previous meetings. That's the majority of their jobs. Now, I don't know where he got that data. That seems a little cynical to me, but he said it was actually what they did. But I don't know how you can review previous meeting minutes if that's all you ever do, because where did you get the initial meeting minutes? But we got a lot of people walking around here. You used to be worried about that because you're paying for it in your tuition. Are your tuition coming down or going up? Going up. Should be going down. We should be getting much more efficient. Should we be sitting here in the room, or should we all be on Zoom? Should we be doing more efficient things? You know, what should we be doing? So I think those two industries, healthcare and education, are destroying productivity in the world. But I can't prove that. Other people say it's technology is just not that exciting as we think it is. So people say, wow, we're radically changing the world. But people say, but in early 20th century, we went from no electricity to electricity. We went from no cars to cars. We went from no airplanes to airplanes. We went from no air conditioners to air. How would your productivity be in San Antonio if we didn't have air conditioning?
You'd be dead.
You would be, dude?
I would be dead.
You'd be dead. Yeah, I couldn't survive that. I think air conditioning is the most important invention in the history of mankind. So what's the productivity change from? Well, I think I was reading an article. It's pretty amazing. If you went to 1300s and you took the people on 1300 and moved them to 1500, they would be able to have no trouble surviving. You took people from 1500 and took them to 1800, they would be a little confused, but they'd be able to survive. You take the people from 1900 to 1950, they would be blown away. Then you take people from 1950 to 1975, they'd be blown away. You take people from 1975 to 1990, they would be complete. I mean, it's amazing how short that's getting. So the question is, can we keep that going? So do you think 15 years from now, if I took you in a time machine 15 years from now, you'd be blown away? or not? Would it be as surprising as 1950 to 1970, or would it be more, and is it possible? Do you think college classrooms 15 years from now are going to look radically different? You hope so. I hope so. I hope the entire university system just gets completely put out of business and we find some, but I'm always wishing everything gets put out of business and something better comes along. So that's where you're thinking on productivity. So is artificial intelligence really going to radically change our lives or not? I've never used Alexa. I've never used Alexa. I don't know what it does for you. Is that making your lives more efficient? I have a smart air conditioner at home, drives me crazy because I don't know why it suddenly changes the temperature. I don't tell it to. So it's more advanced than I need. So are we going to be more productive in the future or less productive? What's going to be that major thing? Some people say we're running out of ideas. There's an Economist article just this last week. We're just running out of huge ideas to radically change the world. We're just getting much smaller in ideas, but who knows? I think autonomous vehicle could radically change the world, but it's not coming along as fast as we had hoped. The other argument can be productivity is changing. Historically, productivity made workers more productive. So you put machinery onto a line, at the auto manufacturing, the worker, you have the same number of workers, but they're a lot more productive, so you can pay them a lot more. Some people argue productivity today is replacing workers. It's robotics, it's things that, so we don't need workers anymore. Now you can debate that. I watch on Facebook, I know people that say, I'm never going to use the self-checkout at HEB. I'm not going to mop their floors, I'm not going to do self-checkout, and I don't want to destroy workers. To me, I love self-checkout because I get out a lot faster. The argument that I'm destroying workers, the problem with that is economic research has shown that the firms that use more automation to replace workers hire more people than the firms that don't use automation to replace workers. They hire fewer workers. So when HEB does self-checkout, they don't cut their workers, they get workers to do more stuff that's more valuable. So you can debate that all you want. There's a lot of debate on this. I know who was the guy who ran for president and then ran for mayor of New York? Yancey, or you know what I'm talking about? Gosh, I can't remember his name, but that's his big thing. Productivity is going to replace workers. We've got to somehow tackle that now. I think most economists are saying it's too early to say that. We really don't know. We're going to have to wait and see what happens. Yeah, I've seen the articles that, technology is going to replace what, 50% of accounting jobs and 40% of finance jobs. Is that happening yet? It's hard to say that. I do think it's going to change the way you work as an accountant. You're probably going to need to know programming languages a lot more than as an accountant, but will it replace workers? Who knows? So this is a big unknown. Why has productivity been so weak this last decade? Will it go back to norm levels? If it's productivity is going to come back to higher levels because if you're replacing workers, does that mean labor growth is going to be weak? And then what's the big thing impacting labor growth right now? So Derek and Luke, y'all are in my life insurance class. What's going on with workers there? Baby boomers, right? You're reading about baby boomers. What are baby boomers doing? Supposedly retiring. You're hoping they're retiring because you want their job. That's going to give us negative labor growth. How do you offset that? Have more babies, or you have immigration. We're not doing very well on either one of those. So those are the debates you got to go in, and politicians are supposed to be addressing these. So President Obama said the key is education. I'm pretty cynical on education. You should read the book, The Case Against Education. It's pretty scary how little we're actually learning in school. Really, y'all seen the interviews on the streets, right? How many stars in the U.S. flag? Why does everybody say 51? Do people think Puerto Rico's become a state? I don't get that. They show a picture of George Washington and they don't know who it is. And it's like, I'm sure they interviewed 100 people and they're just picking the 3 worst, don't you think? That people know these, but anyway, but education is not working. A lot of studies have shown education is not working at all. Some of it's pretty pathetically sad, not just at public schools, but even university students are coming out knowing very little. So if education is the solution, then we got to radically change education. People keep asking me about Biden forgiving student debt. And my issue with that is, why do we keep focusing on demand side? Why don't we focus on supply side? We're doing that with healthcare and education. Supply side's a mess. Instead of fixing that, we're just having the government subsidize the demand side. I'm like, let's fix the supply side because we're grossly overcharging for services on the supply side. Isn't that the problem? Education is overcharging for its products. Do we want to just subsidize students, or why don't we fix the education industry? So, those are the debates you got to make. This will be the key to your future. Productivity is the driver of wealth. So if our economy has 1% productivity, you're going to be half as wealthy as if we have 2% productivity. It's a major part of your future, so you should be really concerned about it. You should read articles on that. Pretty important stuff. So historically, stocks have given us a 4% dividend yield. We know today it's like 1.5%, but we might adjust that up to 3% because of stock buyback. So dividend yields are low, but they may not be as low as that looks like. But historically, we've gotten 4% dividend yields. And in growth and earnings, you saw that about 6%, 5 point, what was it? I can't remember, 6.41. So 6% earnings growth. So historically, stocks have given us about a 10% return. Going forward, the current dividend yields are like 1.5%. In economic growth going forward, you'll see what you're going to use on papers 3 and 4, but expected productivity growth, maybe 2%. Labor growth, maybe 0. I put 1% down there. And expected inflation, maybe 2%. Now you could say, well, inflation can be a lot higher, but that's not the kind of growth you want, because that doesn't increase your standard of living. If the economy is growing 2% faster because of inflation, it's also everything's costing you 2% more. So your standard of living doesn't improve at all. So those are the questions. The most important to me is productivity, but labor growth is very, very important as well. So where does productivity come from? Innovation. So I'm mentoring a student. He's in high school. He wants to be a portfolio manager. So we're going to start a stock fund for him. And he's got 2 going. He's got a core fund and a satellite. And a satellite fund is going to look a lot like Kathy Wood's. It's going to be a disruptive innovation. So we're talking about disruptive innovation. Where's it coming from? So AI was one. 3D printing is one. Mobility is one. Autonomous vehicles. Microbes is one. I mean, y'all have read stories about microbes. That's pretty huge. Nanotechnology. FinTech. Y'all heard a lot about FinTech. How do y'all do your banking? Has anyone in here never been in a bank lobby in your life? Is that true for anyone? I haven't been in a bank lobby in years, but do y'all go to bank lobbies? Do y'all know what a bank lobby is? Y'all don't even know what I'm talking about. What's a bank lobby? You go there to make deposits, to withdraw funds. You don't need that, right? Y'all do it on your phone now, right? You use Zelle to move money around. So have y'all been to bank lobbies?
Not in years.
Not in years?
No,
Why would you? Y'all use
no,
ATMs?
no.
I used to use an ATM all the time. I don't use an ATM ever anymore. Do y'all use ATM?
And it is cash.
Has if anyone not used cash in the last month? Or do y'all use cash? So FinTech is going to take over the world. FinTech is pretty important when we're talking about immigration. A big part of FinTech is how expats send money home. For some economies, that's 40–50% of their economy. People sending money home to to wherever they were, Venezuela, where they were. That's huge. Right now, that is a horribly unproductive industry. People are charging 10–15% to move money back. That's horrible. We want to get that down as cheap as possible. So innovation in those areas, really, really important. Education, we'll talk more about education. Where's the best education in the world? You see China very high up, Singapore. You see some of the Scandinavian countries up pretty high. Where do you see the United States? How good was your education? Were y'all public education or private school? Public. How good was your education? Mine was horrible and wonderful. Very little in between. I had horrible teachers and had wonderful teachers. The wonderful teachers were underpaid by about 200%. The horrible teachers were worth nothing. I remember my English teacher that our class was during his favorite soap opera, so we watched the soap opera. That was my English teacher. He was grossly overpaid. I can tell you also. So education, how do you fix education? That's the other big question. How do you fix that? We have a former student from UTSA who is the leading expert on that. Have y'all heard of Corey DeAngelis? Y'all so look him up. Y'all know him? How many of y'all have heard of Corey DeAngelis? Go look him up, friend them, get them on. You may not like them if your parents are public school teachers. They're probably will cuss them out. But he's leading edge on education reform in the United States. Very interesting, very incredibly good public speaker. The public school teacher union members don't want to debate him because he's a really good debater. He knows what he's talking about. He's written a really good book. Very impressive young man. I don't even think he's 30 years old yet. Just amazing what he's done. He might be Secretary of Education in a future administration before he shuts down the Department of Education. But there are people out there thinking about that. But if you don't think this classroom is going to look like this in 15 years, what do you think it is going to look like? What is going to be the model that's going to change that? Have y'all heard of the teacher in Singapore that makes 7-digit salary doing online classes? So there are people changing the world. If Scandinavian countries are the best, what did they do different? Y'all have heard of Norway and Sweden where they don't have homework. They spend a lot of time outside during recess, and yet their students learn better than the rest of the world. Why is that? What are they doing that's different? Is China and Singapore the answer? I don't think so, because what do you know about Singapore? Their students are burned out when they get out of senior high, and then they goof off in college. Why? Because they've been so stressed out. Is that the right answer? What has China done recently? They made tutors illegal because these poor kids are like in school all day long, and then they go home and they have a tutor all night, and that burns you out, right? You're just completely. So what is the answer? We have to see. Maybe the Scandinavian countries have the answer. I don't know. Immigration is extremely important. What country has the best immigration policy? The answer is no. No one has figured that out, I don't think, anywhere. Government regulations. We're going to talk about the ease of doing business, although that particular score has gone away. There are cultural issues going on. There's all kinds of things. So we'll talk about that more when we talk about US versus non-US. We're trying to figure out, where in the world are you going to get the best productivity, because that's where you have the best economic growth. That's where you have the best stock market. So that's going to be important. So this is an extremely important concept for you to be thinking about. If I were voting, this is the kind of things I'm thinking about. Who are those politicians that understand this? All right, so there's your intro to stocks. A stock is a ownership in a company. You're going to share in the success and failure of the company. Ultimately, it's the dividend yield plus earnings growth. Earnings growth for the overall stock market is going to be tied to the economy. Economic growth comes from productivity, labor, and inflation. That's how you understand the stocks. Pretty simple, pretty easy, but not very simple. It's not easy to understand. Now let's get into the details of the stock market. Unless y'all have comments, questions. I'm trying to rile you up a little bit, but I don't know if I'm riling you up. I love stepping on toes just because to wake you up. But some controversial stuff there. I just read a really, really good book. I'd never heard of this guy before. His name is Albert Woodfox. Have you ever heard of him? His obituary was in The Economist, and so I looked him up. I just thought, real fascinating. He wrote a book, so I read his book. I disagree with him. He doesn't like capitalism. He's very socialistic, communistic, but boy, I would love to sit down. Would have been if I could have sat down and talked with him, I would have learned a lot. It was really interesting. But he holds the record for the longest anyone has been in solitary confinement. You want to guess how many years that was? More than 5, more than 10. I think it was 43 years he was in solitary confinement. And he came out sane and and intellectual. So somehow so I wanted to just hear his stories. Like, how did you survive this and come out strong? Really impressive. You also read the book, even if you disagree with anything he says. Really, really impressive guy. I was pretty amazed. So anyway, just throw that out. There's people with different views, and I like listening to them. Just as you got to read. Well, I read this guy. What's the guy's name? I'm reading a new book. Boy, I've got it on my phone. It's a tough book to read because this guy's way over my head. He's like 10 times smarter than I am. He said the growth of knowledge depends entirely on disagreement. So when you read books, you should find books that strongly disagree with what you think and read those. And that's why I knew when I read Albert Wood Fox's book, he was going to say stuff I didn't agree with. And sure enough, he did. But boy, was it an impressive book. But so if in finance, you need to get outside of your comfort zone and read stuff from people you don't really like. Pinkerton, y'all read Pinkerton? Interesting books, right? He's got a new book out here recently. I don't know if I'll read it or not. I read Adam Smith and Pinkerton all in the same setting, so I kind of got the two extremes. But in finance, you need to be open up to these ideas because you're going to be an investor and you're going to be somewhat stuck with these policies that countries implement. You got to know your own philosophy. All right. So let's break down stocks into our subcategories, or into our strategies here. Is Bucks, B-U-C-S, Bucks, B for beta. U is the same as before, U.S. versus non-U.S., except for here, it's actually going to be a sub-asset class, unlike with bonds where it's really an alternative. C is capitalization, and then S is style. Remember, the S under bonds is structure. The S under beta is S under stocks is style. Okay, don't get those mixed up. There is no style under bonds. We don't have growth bonds and value bonds. We have growth stocks and value stocks. All right, so we'll start with beta. Now, you've heard of beta because you had the capital asset pricing model in 2013, the most famous model in finance. But the word beta has taken on a life of its own. So beta is a number we plug into that formula, and you'll do that in paper 3. But beta also has a much bigger context. So the word beta has come to mean, what markets are you invested in? So your beta risk, what I mean by beta risk, it's really what most people think by beta risk is how much do you have in the stock market? But there's also the other context of, are you investing in high beta stocks or low beta stocks? So it's taken a word. So one of the things I said you could Google, I don't know if you tried it, but was alpha beta separation. Any of y'all try that? So if you really want to understand the context of beta, alpha beta separation is a really interesting concept. You might want to look it up. We did it at USA. I found it really fascinating. So we're going to talk a little bit more about passive investing. Passive investing, you just buy the index. You just go to Vanguard or BlackRock, you just buy the S&P 500. And you'll get that really, really cheap. So that's your beta risk. Alpha risk is how you want to beat the market. So alpha beta separation is you buy the market just by buying an index fund, and then you go get your alpha from a hedge fund. And the hedge fund, they can invest anywhere in the world and try to get you alpha. Whereas if you go to Fidelity and try to get your alpha there, if they're buying large company stocks, they can only get you alpha from large company stocks. That's their only source of alpha. They can overweight Apple or underweight Apple, but that's their only choice. They can't go buy gold, or they can't buy oil. They can't buy bonds in the UK. All they can do is give you alpha from the market they're in. But if you just buy the S&P 500 and then you go to a hedge fund and say, hey, give me your alpha, they can go anywhere in the world to get the alpha. So that's what alpha beta separation is. So you see how the word beta, so don't get confused. We're going to use beta later as a number, but here the word beta really is, where is your risk coming from? What markets are you in? So number one on beta risk is how much do you have in stocks versus bonds? That one's pretty obvious. You're expecting a recession, where would you want to be, stocks or bonds? So if I tell you we're definitely going to have a recession, would you rather buy treasuries or buy stocks? Treasuries, right? So if you're expecting recession, bonds are going to do much better in a recession. Now, the problem we have right now, if we have a recession and interest rates keep rising, nothing's going to do well. That's the inflation side. Stocks and bonds both do horribly in inflationary environments. But if it's a typical recession, like in 2008, stocks are down 35%, treasuries are up 25, 30%. So at the beginning of 2008, you'd put all your money in long-term treasuries, you would have looked like a genius at the end of the year. Would have worked really, really well. The second thing you can do with beta is what industries are you going to be in? There are high beta sectors and there are low beta sectors. So here's the words you want to use: cyclical and defensive. Cyclical stocks are high beta, defensive stocks are low beta. You probably have heard these terms before. You probably talk about high beta and low beta in 3013. And Josh and Jacob, y'all remember that one Excel application you had to do where you had to come up with the beta for Kroger's and forget. So you're going to do that again in this class. There's some redundancy there. But retail can be high beta. Nordstrom's. When's the last time you heard someone say, hey, I'm really worried about losing my job. I have to give up on Walmart. I think I'm doing all my shopping at Nordstrom's. Does that sound like a normal conversation? Probably not. Durable goods. Hey, I'm worried about losing my job. I'm going to cut back on cereal. I need to go buy me a car. Probably not what's going to be the conversation. Doesn't make sense. Or I'm worried about losing my job. I think I can go travel this summer. No, you're probably just going to not take any vacation at all so they don't lay you off. Commodities and material stocks, steel, concrete, those tend to be very sensitive. Now, oil's a little shaky as far as it being a cyclical stock. We tend to drive about the same in a recession. It's true if people are losing their jobs and not driving to work, but COVID has somewhat messed that up. But definitely production goods like steel, like concrete, like copper, those tend to be very, very sensitive. Travel and leisure, anything consumer discretionary. So discretionary just means, hey, if you're worried about losing your job, you can cut back on that. You don't have to make that purchase. So those are high beta stocks. A low beta stock or defensive stock, department stores. Walmart is a perfect example. Walmart did great in 2008. Walmart did great at the beginning of the COVID. So Walmart has really proven itself not just to do okay in a recession, but to actually excel and do extremely well. And people do cut back. They don't just cut back on Nordstrom's, they also cut back on restaurants. So instead of going to a restaurant, they go to Walmart and they eat at home. I've never been, what is it, Roman noodles? Is it Roma? Ramen noodle. I never eaten those in my life. But supposedly that's the go-to if you're worried about your budget. So you switch to these type of firms: Costco, FDO, Family Dollar. Gas, I have commodities up here. Gasoline, we tend to buy gas no matter what. So that's one of the reasons they have core inflation. So when core inflation takes gas and food out of the inflation number, the reason they do that is when food and gas prices go up, we tend to keep buying those and we tend to cut back on everything else. So gas and food prices being high tends to be recessionary because we have to keep buying those things, so we cut back on everything else. Food, and here I mean really from grocery stores, whereas up here restaurants could be a consumer discretionary. Now Walmart is a little shaky. I'm not Walmart. McDonald's is a little shaky. McDonald's is actually a cheap way to buy calories. If you look at what you're paying per calorie, it's actually a fairly cheap source of calories. Maybe not as cheap as HEB, but pretty cheap. I've been eating out more here recently. I'm shocked at how expensive it is to eat. I was at Neater's the other day and just got my typical meal. It was over $20 for one person. That seems high to me. Does that seem high to y'all, or are y'all getting used to $20?
Where
What
was
it?
it?
Huh?
Where was it at?
Neater's.
Oh, Neater's.
Yeah, I love Neater's. Really good. They think I'm eating for two because they bring it out and they put it in two places. Like, no, this is all mine. But I do eat a lot of calories, but still $20 is a lot. How much does it cost you to eat at McDonald's now? Not that y'all would know, but your friends, what did he tell you? Can you 10? So under 10 or over 10? Still under 10. So you can eat pretty decently at McDonald's for under 10. So that's a pretty big advantage for them. So it can be questionable where you fit. I would not put McDonald's as a cyclical stock. I would not consider them defensive either. So they're kind of in the middle. But a higher end restaurant would certainly be more expensive and would probably cut back. Now you can debate that as well. It's possible high end restaurants are selling to millionaires and billionaires who don't really care. So it depends on how high you. I haven't been at the Chris Steakhouse in a while. Are they going to suffer in a recession? It's hard to say. It's not always obvious. I put here durable goods. Cars. Dr. Damodaran has a really good YouTube video where he talks about Ferrari. Is Ferrari a cyclical stock or is it a defensive stock? How many of y'all own a Ferrari? Who buys Ferraris? Not millionaires. Who buys Ferraris? Billionaires. Are billionaires worried about recessions? Billionaires say, hey, I was going to buy a Ferrari this year, but boy, I'm down to 32 billion. I better cut back. So he actually argues that Ferrari is a low beta defensive stock because the people they sell to. Same thing with yachts and other things, So you have to really think carefully about it because it's not just obvious that all auto manufacturers are high beta, but most of them are. I think Tesla is, even though Tesla probably sells a higher end, but they're probably selling to people making 6 digits, not 12-digit salaries. So, they are going to be a little sensitive to that. Utilities, telecom used to be considered a defensive stock. It's getting a little trickier now if that's true because AT&T and these firms are really changing their businesses. Healthcare tends to be defensive, but not always. Kind of depends on exactly what the healthcare is. The struggle with healthcare is most of us don't pay for healthcare. We don't buy healthcare, we buy health insurance. And so we don't care how much it costs because we're not paying for it. So it's a little unusual. We'll talk about that. Unfortunately, Derek and Luke are going to get my soapboxes on that. But yeah, healthcare is a really unusual. But because most of us get our healthcare from our employer, when employment rates rise, that does have an impact on the healthcare. Technology has generally been considered above 1, but technology is getting a little questionable. I think there's people who would give up their utilities before they would give up their iPhone or their iPhone apps or whatever. So it's hard to say. Your generation may not be doing this room, but the articles are saying your generation would rather have social media and a smartphone than to have their own car and drive. Like, I don't need a car. Give me a bus. I can do my social media on the bus. It's even better because I can't be doing, well, a lot of people do social media while they're driving, but so I don't know. I don't know if your generation has changed that much. For my generation, getting your car and driving was the ultimate thing. That's the only thing we cared about. But it may be possible technology becoming so ingrained into our lives that's something we're not going to give up. I don't think of it as defensive though. I think it's maybe if anything's in between. But 20 years ago, technology was a high beta stock, especially with the 2000, 2001 fiasco with all the dot-com stocks blowing up. That definitely gave us the concept of a high beta. So you have high beta stocks and low beta, and it's so simple. If you're expecting a recession, where do you want to be on this list? Defensive. If you're expecting to come out of recession, where do you want to be? Cyclical, isn't it? Pretty straight. You already knew that even without this class. So you have two decisions. You're expecting recession, you want to reduce your stock allocation, and within stocks, you want to reduce your beta, move from cyclical to defensive. Write that term down in your notes, within stocks. So if you're expecting a recession, you want to reduce stocks overall, and then within stocks, you want to reduce cyclical and increase defensive. All right, so you'll be using that term within stocks on the exam in both questions.
Under defensive subcategory 2, can we categorize companies like General Mills or those manufacturers basically as defensive stock.
Yeah, General Mills would definitely be defensive.
Yeah.
Kellogg's definitely.
That's right.
Yeah, those are consumer staples. You might be thinking, well, they're brands, so they're more expensive than the HEB brand. So their beta is going to be a little bit higher than HEB, but not radically so. Yeah, they're going to be like a 0.5, 0.6 kind of beta.
And within the subcategory, they must be higher beta compared to the store brands, basically. But
Right.
generally, the whole category.
And we can't give a beta to the store brands because we can just give a beta to Kroger's.
Sure.
But Kroger's store brands are probably going to be sold more in a recession than Kellogg's, and so they'll do a little bit better there. But yeah, it's debatable. You can certainly debate it, and that's why on paper 3, you're going to actually justify, and on the exam justify your beta. I think that's really, really important. So we'll talk about that more. I have a very specific view on beta that I want to somewhat like maybe indoctrinate you with. I actually want to change your view of it on it. So there's certainly debates within here. The question is, bottom line, how will this particular industry or stock or sector, how will it perform if we go into a recession? Will do better than average. If it does better than average, then it's defensive. If it's going to be worse than average, then it's cyclical. That's the bottom line. So if I say defense spending, is that cyclical or is that defensive? It sounds defensive. Well, you say, well, it's durable goods. We're talking about ships and planes and tanks. But what happens in recession? Well, governments tend to spend more money in recession, so they may actually increase defense spending in recession, so they may do well. What's the right answer? Well, you have to go research it. How did defense companies do in 2008? How did they do in the last recessions? How did they come out of recession? So those kind of questions you're looking at. So it's not always obvious, but you can definitely sit down and logic through it. And we'll do that more in this class, don't worry. Here's my list, and this is just my opinion. To me, I think of energy being low to medium kind of beta because we don't cut back on gasoline that dramatically. Materials, high beta, no question. Now you might say, well, gold is a material. Gold is a low beta, so there are materials that are low beta, but most materials are high beta. Industrials, just by definition, industrials are high beta. If you're building trucks or whatever, that's a high beta. Now, communication services, that includes AT&T and those stuff, but also includes the Googles and the Facebooks, those firms that are mainly advertising. Now, advertising has historically been high beta. When we go into recession, firms cut back on their advertising. And then the thought process was that they're going to cut back on their TV advertising or newspaper, but they're not going to cut back on Facebook and Google. Well, I've seen here recently, people are cutting back on Facebook. People are saying, hey, you know what? I can spend that money somewhere else. So Facebook is starting to face that issue as well. So it's questionable. I kind of low to medium. I go up to 1.5 because advertising has been historically considered a high beta. Consumer discretionary, just by definition, is high beta. Ferrari might be the exception there, but just by definition, and consumer staples by definition are low beta. Healthcare, it kind of depends on what kind of healthcare. Financials, in 2008, financials were high beta because they were what was blowing up. Financials are a little tricky. It really depends. But 2008, yeah, the betas for financials like banks, their betas jumped up to 2.53, really, really high. But they were in the middle of the storm. It just depends on the type. So betas aren't the same in every environment. So it can vary. Tech has traditionally been considered high beta, but there are some medium ones. Real estate has traditionally been high beta, but not always. It can depend on the type of real estate. And utilities are low beta. We're going to pay for our utilities. Even if you say, I'm going to keep my smartphone no matter what, you still got to plug in the power. So you at least want electricity. I doubt anyone would say, I'm going to give up on electricity in San Antonio. So we're fortunate that our utilities are pretty cheap here in San Antonio, so it's not that big of an issue. But it's still, Well, I think, what do they say in the UK and Europe? Utilities are gonna be what, an extra $5,000 a year for them? That's gonna definitely have an impact. Do you think people are gonna give up on utilities in that scenario? So governments are trying to subsidize it, try to keep it low. So we're seeing some unusual things, but people could definitely cut back on the utilities, but they're not gonna go to zero. And that's real key on beta. We're not saying a low beta company is gonna do great in a recession. Everything's relative. Are they gonna do better than average or worse than average? So there's some companies that may actually do badly in a recession, but they don't do as badly as other companies. So they would still be a lower beta. That's why I mentioned McDonald's. McDonald's is probably going to see their sales drop some in a recession, but probably not as much as a more expensive food like Panera. I haven't been to Panera in a while. I was shocked first time I went to Panera. Is like, this is all I'm getting, and they're charging me that much. I thought it was a horrible deal, but y'all might love Panera. I don't know. I'm a volume eater. I want massive amounts of food, so that's what I'm after. I don't like the little nuances. They're gonna, put a piece of lettuce on the plate, make it look pretty. That doesn't help me. All right, so the definition of beta is really, how are you gonna do in a recession? What's your exposure to the stock market? Your categories are high beta, medium beta, and low beta, are cyclical and defensive. Your tactical move, really straightforward. You're expecting a recession, reduce your stock allocation overall. And then within stocks, I should have put that on the note in the page here. Within stocks, move your beta down, reduce. And it's really simple. Beta is a really simple thing. The beta of your portfolio is just the weighted average beta of all the stocks. So if you want to reduce the beta of your portfolio, you just sell high beta stocks and buy low beta stocks. It really is that simple. Very, very straightforward. The question is, do you know the beta of your portfolio? And we'll talk about that. You certainly can figure out the calculated beta of your portfolio, but the calculated beta of your portfolio is just the beta of your portfolio the last 3 years. But that may be different going forward. The last 3 years we had COVID. That probably impacted your beta. You may not think that's the case going forward. In fact, the beta for Walmart the last 3 years might be a negative number. We'll look and see. That's probably not what you expect going forward. So it's hard to actually calculate the true. So how have these different industries done year to date, 2022? Energy is the only thing up, and it's up a bunch. How many of y'all had 100% of your stock portfolio in energy at 12/31/2021? I'd be impressed if you did. Everything else is down except for what? Utilities. Why? Because utilities is a low beta stock. But consumer staples weren't down that much. So you can see, you say, how can they be low beta if they had a negative return? But their return was much better than the stock market. Tech was down dramatically, but that's partly because tech was in the eye of the storm. We'll talk about growth stocks and how they did. Consumer services, that's down. Why? But because the biggest stock in that one is what? Facebook. How did Facebook do this year? So Facebook is driving that number. Consumer discretionary is down more than consumer staples. That makes sense. Healthcare. Now, industrials didn't do that badly, but that's partly because industrials weren't in the eye of the storm. And it's also partly because of the Russian-Ukraine war. Why? Because industrial prices shot up, right? Because we had a shortage. So they may have actually even benefited. Materials were down. Financials were down, not dramatic. Financials are down about like the S&P 500. 1 year, essentially the same question, except for energy is up just ridiculously. Why? Because oil prices shot up dramatically. Over 5 years, what do you notice is number one? Tech. Over 10 years, tech. So tech is giving back some of what it gained, but it's up there dramatically. Consumer services didn't do that well, but that's again Facebook. Facebook is driven to drag that thing down dramatically. So the S&P 500 has done really, really well last 10 years, driven really strongly by tech. Consumer discretionary has done well. Consumer staples has done well. Energy has not done well last 10 years, but the last year it has. So been a really, really good stock market. Last 25 years. Can you believe that consumer discretionary has beat tech the last 25 years? The S&P 500 is up about 8%. What is that? That's a 2% dividend yield and 6% earnings growth. Exactly what you would expect. Consumer discretionary is up 10%. Healthcare is doing pretty well. Consumer services here. Part of the challenge there is, I don't know exactly. A lot of these consumer services stocks were in technology, and they moved them from technology to consumers. So Google and Facebook got moved. I don't know exactly how they did that in these calculations. If consumer services was predominantly utilities, utilities have been, I mean, not utilities, telecom. Telecom has not done that well the last 25 years. Anything else stand out to you? Financials, you know, we had the 2008 crisis in there. That certainly didn't help financials at all. Anything look unusual? Consumer staples right in line with the market. Industrials right in line with the market. So the two standouts, consumer services and financials, are the worst ones. Consumer staples and tech are the strong ones. But who cares about this? What's it going to be the next 25 years? It's going to look like this the next 25 years, do you think? Who knows? Be interesting to see. All right, so there's the B for bucks. Beta, really important concept. So what would you be doing right now? Are you increasing beta right now or reducing beta right now? Now the obvious answer, well, reduce beta, but you can't, look in the rearview mirror. I don't say what should you have been doing 3 months ago. I'm saying what should you do today? So is the market bottom? I've seen several articles saying I think the market's bottomed. Oh, boy, why are people saying the market bottomed? Because you see that channel, you know what a channel is? And what did the market do here recently? Broke out of the channel. So what are we doing now? We got a channel like that, right? So that's the technical people saying we've bottomed. When will the technical people know they're wrong? This blue line goes below that line. Then we'll just have to increase the channel. So that's the argument part that we bottomed because we had a good breakout here. But the bottom line comes down to how bad is the recession going to be. Soft landing, stocks will do pretty well. Hard landing, really bad recession, it's going to be terrible. But that's the question you gotta answer. So I personally, what I've been doing this year, I haven't been doing high beta and low beta. I've been doing growth versus value. So I went full-fledged value stocks beginning this year. I just thought tech is going to crash, interest rates going to rise. We'll talk about that. It's a little tricky. I'm going to talk about it tomorrow night in Investment Society. It's going to be growth versus value, how we get into that. That is a different question besides beta. There is some overlap between beta and growth and value. People tend to think of growth stocks as being higher beta and value stocks being lower beta. That's not always true. So we'll have to make sure we're not confusing that. But this is what you're going to be doing. You have to do in the investment world. You got to set up your client's portfolio. Are you going to go high beta or low beta right now? If you think the markets are bottom, then you want to go high beta and take the recovery. If you think we have another leg down, then you want to do low betas. So how often will you be right? How often will you be wrong? Who knows? And if you're right, were you right because you're smart or because you're lucky? Who knows? What are you going to tell your boss? Because I was smart. What if you're wrong? What do you tell your boss? I was right, but we're just unlucky. That's what you got to do in finance. How many times will your boss let you be wrong and unlucky over and over and over again? Eventually, you're going to have to get it right, or they're not going to keep you on. But it's tough, right? This is not easy stuff. And everybody else out there is doing the exact same thing you are. It all comes down to who's smarter and who's luckier. You got to be both smarter and luckier. Which would you rather be, smart and lose money, or not so smart and lucky and make a lot of money? Which would you rather do the next 10 years? None of us like to say we're not very smart, but we like making a lot of money. What actually happens is the not smart ones that are really lucky, they don't know they're not smart. They think they're smart because they made a lot of money. I love this presentation. One of the guys is talking to some economists, and he says, "If you're so smart, why aren't you rich?" And the economist said, "If you're so rich, why aren't you smart?" And the guy said, "Okay, thanks." What was he saying? You're rich because you're lucky. So, all right, let's get into the next one. Capitalization. I'm going to skip the U because it doesn't make sense to do the U next. So I just did bucks because it spells something. So capitalization. So capitalization, we have several categories here, but capitalization is just how large is the company. So what is market capitalization? That's just how large the company is. So you see Apple is the biggest stock out there. How big is Apple? Right now they're 2.5 trillion. I think they hit 3 trillion there for a minute. I remember they hit a trillion, which just seems like a few weeks ago. When they hit a trillion, people were like, "My word, we got $1 trillion stock." Are they really the biggest stock around? So I don't know. What's the Saudi Arabian company? Aramco. I don't know how to spell it. Yeah, they should have a market cap. Yeah, they say 8 trillion, but I don't know if that's in US dollars or not.
It
So-
did surpass Apple, but it's not public much earlier.
Yeah, I had heard that with the oil prices coming down, that I don't think they're 8 trillion, but I don't know what current. Yahoo Finance is really strange on currencies. All right, so we're going to divide it into these groups: large cap, medium cap. That's somewhat of a new group. Medium cap, small cap, and then we're going to ignore the last two: micro cap and penny stocks. That's really specialized. Most people don't go that small. So large cap, how large is large cap? Well, kind of depends on where the market is. When the market gets bigger, you have to keep moving it higher and higher and higher. Aramco. Okay, thanks, Julian. I don't know how large they say it is in US dollars. I'll have to look that up.
It is in US dollars.
That is 8 trillion.
Yeah, the revenue for.
I guess it's possible with oil prices back up, because that was a massive, from $20 to $90, that could do it. Yeah.
Their net income for current year was 170
Yeah.
billion.
Yeah, it's ridiculous how much money they make. Yeah, and this is not a bad environment for them. Okay, so large cap, we say 20 billion, but 20 billion is really not that large anymore. So it kind of depends. We have all these massive companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft that are just ridiculously large. Mid cap, I say $1 billion. $1 billion is really small for mid cap. So don't memorize these numbers. It really does change depending on the markets. But a $5 billion company would probably be mid cap. 1 to 2 billion, we'd probably classify as small cap. Small cap, would you go to as small as 100 million? That's a really small company. And in micro cap, those are just really small companies. And in penny stocks, essentially penny stocks are companies that are out of business, but their stock's still trading. The stock is worthless, but it still trades. It might be 20 cents one day and 70 cents. So you can make a lot of money on penny stocks, but it's about like going to Vegas. I mean, you're just rolling the dice. So GM, General Motors stock, when they went bankrupt, their stock kept trading. You could have traded, and there was days where they're up 50, 100%, but you knew it was worthless. But people were just trading, because it was out there, and it was trading mainly because the short sellers made a fortune on it, and they can't make their money without closing the trade down. So they want to buy it back so they can close the trade down. And when they buy it back, the stock shoots up 20 cents, 30 cents. So we're going to ignore penny stocks. So these are the main categories. Now, for the longest time, it was just large cap and small cap. I think we saw with William Sharp and his 13 categories or whatever he had, I think he had mid cap in there. So I think he even started looking at mid cap. Remember parsimonious. Do we need to break out mid cap from small cap? The current thought is, yes, there is a difference between mid and small cap. They do deserve their own categories. They tend to be highly correlated to each other. And so what it really comes down to is within stocks, that's really important. Within stocks, large cap tend to have the lower expected return and the lower risk. And small cap tend to have the higher expected return, the higher risk. So we just think about that. And pretty straightforward. If you're expecting recession, you do not want small company stocks. They're the most likely to go out of business. They're the most likely to have trouble finding capital, borrowing money. So if you're expecting recession, you want to move up on capital. You want larger companies that can survive the recession better. You want to avoid small cap. If you're expecting a strong recovery, you probably want to over allocate small companies and pull back some on large companies. So here's where the within stocks makes sense. So we're expecting a recession. I want to reduce my stocks overall, but within stocks, I want to over allocate large cap, under allocate small cap. So that's where that within stocks becomes important. Now, small cap have been an interesting asset class long-term because they've had higher returns than large cap, but much, much higher returns relative to their risk. And it's been somewhat of a question in corporate finance, especially with college professors, is why do small caps earn so much more than they should? Now, I think recently that's come back because the large tech companies have done so well, but small cap have been somewhat of an uncertainty. So here I graph large cap and small cap. You can see mid cap has actually been the one that's done the best, but mid cap and small cap have really materially outperformed large cap, much more than what college academia says they should given their risks. So they've really given us, and actually small cap value stocks, we'll talk about that here in a little bit, have really been the place to be. I've actually been pushing small cap value here recently. I just think their time is coming back. But you can see they're highly correlated with each other. And the in the .com, they all, I mean in the COVID, they all crashed. In 2008, they all crashed. In the .com, they all crashed. You can't tell here. I should have done a log normal chart. All right, so pretty straightforward, small cap, large cap. So we'll finish up with style. Style is very, very important. You'll see that quite a bit. And then US versus non-US. We might finish stocks on Thursday, so we're getting close there. One thing I did want to tell you, we are going to have, the Investment Society will have its classes. I'll email this out. And our sectors. So if you really want to add a lot of stuff to your resume really fast, this is an easy way to do it. So we have a Tableau class. I don't know how many of y'all know Tableau. It's really good, get Tableau. And Waylon does a good enough job. I mean, it's not much you can do in just one semester. He does a good enough job that you can at least put, you have experience with Tableau on your resume. You won't be an expert. He just doesn't have, it's really hard to do that. There's going to be a fact exam review. We haven't had many people show up to that, but then after the semester, I have like 7 or 8 students. Hey, I need help on the fact exams. So we're going to produce, if no one shows up at the class, we're going to produce a really good video that we can just provide to people. I think you've all finished your fact exam, haven't you? So that's, you don't need that one. Andrew has a really popular class where he's going to talk commercial real estate. He has a lot of experience there. Victor is going to talk blockchain and cryptocurrency if you want some background there. Kennan's going to do a class. What I said is go find those Excel things they tend to ask you on resumes, on interviews. So if you don't know pivot tables and VLOOKUPs and those kind of things, he's going to cover those. I'm going to do a basic wealth management because that was real popular years ago. I've never done it, but another guy did it. So I'm going to do that. Just where do you even start? Some of it's going to be similar to stuff we've done in here, but even getting more basic than that. Colin wants to do a stats class using Python. Just how do you take what you learn in your stats class and actually apply it? And then we have these sector teams, which show you on the sector teams, they're going to teach Excel, Bloomberg, and Capital IQ. We're going to use all 3 of them so you can get experience in all of those and just learn. If you've never done a stock screening model, they're going to do a stock screening model in the fall. We screen for stocks to get down to a buy list. And then in the spring, we take that buy list and get down to an actual final recommendation. So The fall is mainly computer, Excel, and then the spring is writing an analyst report, doing some valuations. So it's a really good process. I encourage students, if you're interested on the investment side, you need to have done some, at least pretend stock trading. And this is a good way to do that. So you can actually go through the process. Also, they like on investment interviews, I like to ask for a stock idea. And this will give you a stock idea. You can say, hey, I really recommend this Ecolabs because of these reasons. And it gives you a really powerful thing, especially more in the spring than the fall, but definitely will give you that. So if you're interested in any of these, take a picture. I'll try to send it out as well. So we'll have classes Tuesday, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, starting next Tuesday. Any questions on that? So our focus this time is making good videos because only 1 or 2 students have shown up in the past. That's the huge advantage you have. There's a good chance you come to the class, there may only be 1 or 2 others, so you can really get as much out of it you want. It's 45 minutes a week, so it's not a tremendous amount of time. All right, let me check real quick. Leo, Jaden, Warna, Alejandro, Isabella. All right. Before we do today's class, you got a paper next week. So I'm looking for a volunteer. Maybe on, I think Tuesday would be better than Thursday because Thursday doesn't give you much time. We'll see. But if I can have a volunteer that I grade your paper in class, I can leave your name off of it if you want. I'll grade your paper in class. I'll go through the exact grading process. So if someone wants to volunteer to do that, let me know. You have to send me your paper. If you're ready by Tuesday, send it to me by Tuesday. If not, I'll do it on Thursday. That way you can see how I actually grade it. But I've seen a couple papers, so some of y'all are getting there ahead. So let me just show you, the kind of thing I think this is one of the things. I'll try to find a paper from last semester that has this issue, but I was listening to a podcast today, and it's this idea of, this is by Karl Popper. I don't know if you've heard of him, but a philosopher. He's a little hard to read when I'm on my bike because I'm constantly having to go back 30 seconds because he'll say something, my mind starts wandering, and I'm like, okay, I missed the last 3 minutes. But he talked about the importance of being succinct, being clear. He said the philosophers everyone's talking about today, they're not saying anything, but they're saying it in such a complicated way, no one knows that they're saying nothing because they know how to completely hide what they're actually saying. You've got to be clear. I like one of these famous sayings is, I would have written a shorter paper, but I ran out of time. And that's really what you're after. Does that make sense? Your first draft should be your longest paper, and you should get more and more succinct, clear. I remember I had one of my first boss, actually my boss's boss in finance. This guy scared me to death. Oh my word, it's so intimidating. He used to walk around with a pot of coffee. He was so hyper, he'd bring ice cream to socials, and he was hoping no one would eat any, and he would just eat right out of the bucket the rest of the day. So he was just hyped on caffeine and sugar, just intense. PhD in finance. He edited a lot of books. So, really intimidating for our first boss. But I would take papers. We wrote a lot of white papers. I'd take papers, and I was always scared to do it because if he got it, he would just start ripping to the shreds. But one thing I learned from him, he could take a paper I wrote that was 3 pages long, and he could get it to 2 paragraphs and say more in 2 paragraphs than I said in 3 papers. I learned so much from him. The key is to communicate. What I found I was doing was I was explaining how I did my process. Like I was trying to prove to them that I wasn't stupid. I went through this process. So that's not what they want. They want me to explain what decision do I want. So I don't need to justify, hey, I went through all this. I got this data from here. They don't care about that. Some of you in your papers, you can leave it in there, but I don't need a definition of what GDP is. I don't need a definition of what the employment report is. I don't need don't put a definition of the S&P 500 in your paper. What is your boss going to think if you do that? Now you can leave it in your paper if you want to just, document it for yourself, but in a real life paper, would you explain to your boss what the S&P 500 is? She'd probably think, does this guy think I'm an idiot or what? Of course I know what the S&P 500 is. So those kind of things you can just completely leave out. That will shorten your papers. So to whom are you writing this paper? Your audience is important, but I'm assuming your boss is in finance, probably an investment professional, probably has 20 years of experience. They probably know what the employment report is, or they wouldn't ask you to do this paper. They know what the S&P is. They know those kind of things. So, you can leave in your paper, but it's just adding extra space. I usually just skip through that and hardly even read it. So if you look on something like this, how many sentences is going to take you to do this first line? How many sentences should it take you? Could you do it in one? There were 315,000 jobs added in August, above the 293 consensus and well below the very strong 526,000 for July. How many sentences did it take me? Is that clear? So your boss wants you to write about the jobs report. That would probably be my first sentence in the paper, because that's what she was asking for, isn't it? So as you read through it, it's like, am I communicating? How long does it take you to write all this? I have students that they'll throw the 308 in there, the 22 in there, the 60, and then the 62 goes with the 3.7. But I have students talk about the 62.4 when they're talking about the 315. But the 62.4 is part of the unemployment rate, not part of the jobs. So you got to keep the household survey from the jobs report separate. So you got to make sure they're together where they need to be. If you're not sure about that, then kind of think through it, but make it succinct. Can someone give me a sentence for the 3.7? Any takers on that? Right. If not, the unemployment rate for August was 3.7%, above the 3.5% consensus, and prior month. But if you want to get everything in there, is negative as appears, given the strong rise in the participation rate from 62.1% to August 62.4%. Is that too much in one sentence? Maybe. I know students that what I just put there takes like 3 paragraphs. Is 3 paragraphs too much? Especially if you're using the same number over and over again. If the 3.7 is in your paper 6 times, something's wrong. All right. So stop thinking like a college student and start thinking like an investment professional. You're trying to communicate. Okay, I know there's a lot of students think, hey, if I use a lot of words and get 5 pages instead of 4, it's going to get a higher score. No, you don't get more points for more pages. I don't throw these down the staircase to see which one goes the furthest. So it's I grade it based on who communicates the best. I actually read these not as a college professor. I read this as if I'm your boss. That may be kind of frightening to y'all to think of that, but just imagine I'm your boss. I've got a meeting with the CEO of the company. I know the CEO is going to ask me about this. Your paper is all I got because I've been busy all morning. That's how I'm going to grade it. How good of a job did you do to set me up for that meeting with the CEO? If I have to read 3 paragraphs over and over again to try to figure out what happened in the report, you didn't do a good job. You got to make it succinct. All right. So hopefully we have a volunteer that will. What are your questions on that? I do have students that it's like, wow, this professor, I got to teach myself, and you do. I'm not telling you all the answers here. You got to read articles, but guess what? In your first job, what you have to do? You have to teach yourself. You got to learn how to figure things out on your own and look at it, see what other people are saying. And you also become a really good writer. If you're not sure you're a good writer, come sit down with me. I wasn't such a great writer, but I had a really good high school English teacher, Miss Hutchington, wonderful runner teacher. And then I had that really good finance boss. Between the two of them, my writing got a lot better. But you got to think about your audience, think about what you're trying to communicate. Okay. So today, what we want to do is finish up stocks, capitalization style, US versus non-US. Maybe we'll get into alternatives. So this is what we're after, fleshing this thing out. DC cuts I and bucks. Can anyone do bucks off the top of your head? Don't look at your notes, but what is the B is beta, US for non-US, capitalization, style. Don't say structure. Structure is the S under bonds. Sometimes I get a word that starts with S that's neither structure nor style. Like, especially when it was closed book, is like, I know it starts with an S. I think it was submarine or something, they just make up some word that starts with S. So the U is the same, but the U is very different under bonds than it is under stocks, right? The U under bonds is not there because a lot of people, because of currencies, don't have the U. But under stocks, almost everyone has the U under stocks. That's become a fairly standard allocation, except for Jack Bogle. Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, doesn't think before he passed away, he was arguing don't buy non-US stocks. We'll talk about that some. All right. So let's talk about style. Style is interesting. I was going to talk about this at Investment Society. I've been bumped twice because we've run out of time. So next Wednesday, I'll talk about this. So if you want a little extra on that, I'm going to talk about it. I might even show you what I prepared for the Investment Society. But style is a somewhat of a new thing. We did see it in William Sharp's in his paper. He did talk about growth versus value. So this can get really confusing. So be real careful on how we define these terms. So in your notes, you might write the word quality because quality is important here as well. A lot of students get confused. They see the word value and they think value stocks must be high quality, but it's the exact opposite. Growth stocks are high quality, value stocks are low quality. So you want to associate growth and value with credit ratings. The growth stocks are the high quality companies, the value stocks are the weak and struggling companies. All right, that'll help you with understanding these. So I don't know if y'all have heard the terms growth and value. If you're a growth investor, if you're a value investor, Warren Buffett is considered a value investor. What does that mean? So growth versus value. So a growth stock, these are high quality companies. They're very profitable. They're growing fast. But because they're so high, they're high quality, they're very expensive as well. So growth stock managers, they're buying stocks that are doing great, but boy, they're paying a premium to buy them. They have high price to earnings ratios. That's what a growth stock is. What would be a growth stock today? Maybe Microsoft's a growth stock again. We'll see. We'll look at some numbers and see. I would have a year ago maybe said Meta or Facebook, but we may not have Facebook, may not be a growth stock anymore. We'll look and see. Google or Alphabet might be a growth stock. Zoom would have been a growth stock in 2020, but is it a growth stock today? What's the alternative meat company? Microsoft might be. Microsoft is somewhat reinvented themselves. We'll look. Beyond Meat, that might be a growth stock. Maybe we'll see. It just kind of depends. Tesla might be considered a growth stock. Even Amazon might be, although they're so massive today. Apple and Microsoft and Amazon, they're so massive, but they could be growth stocks. But we're looking for companies with high price to earnings ratios who have just incredibly good numbers. Now, value stocks, these are companies that are struggling. There's something not right. Their earnings might be negative or really low. They're not growing very fast. And because of that, they're really cheap. So that's where the value comes in. The value doesn't mean they're really high quality. The value comes in that they're a good value. They're really cheap stocks. So that's a value company. Warren Buffett historically has avoided tech stocks. I know he had a big investment in Apple there. But he tends to do more value. He does, Dairy Queen, Fruit of the Loom, Northern Railroads. These aren't typically companies we think of as being high tech and high growth companies. So they're cheap. They have low price to earnings ratios. Now, you might think, well, growth stocks do well when the economy is doing well, and value stocks do well when the economy is not doing well. But remember, growth stocks are strong. They tend to have low debt, good earnings. They do better in weak economies because they're doing so well. Value stocks do great in weak economies, in strong economies, because weak economies, they tend to go out of business. All right, so think of value stocks as being somewhat like low quality bonds and growth stocks being like high quality bonds. If you got to think about it, you're going to associate it. That's why this year is such a strange year. Growth stocks also tend to do better when interest rates are low. Now, why is that? Well, because growth stocks, so much of their value is way out in the future because they're growing fast. So interest rates are low, the discount rate's lower, and so their valuation's higher. When interest rates are higher, their discount rate's higher. So much of their value is way, way, way out there. They tend to get lower valuations. So what happened this year? So this year, interest rates have risen. How have growth stocks done this year? Growth stocks have really tumbled this year. But we're also worried about a recession. So this year is really bizarre. Interest rates have risen. That's bad for growth stocks. But we might be going in a recession. That's really bad for value stocks. So which of these do you prefer to have? Maybe neither one. So this is like interest rates is bad for one, recession is bad for the other. If we don't go in a recession and interest rates stay high, value stocks will probably do pretty well, and they'll probably outperform. So far this year, value stocks have outperformed growth stocks. But if we go into recession, you probably don't want value stocks. They have high debt. They're really struggling. So let's see. Let's look at some stocks. So let's look at Google. So Google has a PE ratio of 19. That's actually not all that high. Let's look at Tesla. Oops. Did it come up? There it is. They have a PE ratio of 107. That's a little bit higher, isn't it? Why are you paying $107 for $1 of earnings for Tesla? If their earnings never grow, it's going to take you 107 years to get your money back. Why are you paying 107? Because you're expecting their earnings to grow really, really fast. Have their earnings been growing fast? Well, their earnings used to be negative $1 billion, and now it's 10 billion. That sounds like pretty good growth, doesn't it? So that's a high growth company. What about Apple? Apple has a PE ratio of 25. That's getting up there. Anything over 20 is kind of somewhat growthy. So that's somewhat of a growth company. What about, I don't know if we can even do Macy's, but we'll try. What is Macy's PE ratio? 3. $3 to get $1. If they just stay where they are, you'll get all your money back in 3 years. What is the stock market telling you about Macy's? Is this a stock they're really excited about? Where is Macy's? Almost entirely in malls. How many of y'all not been in a mall in 3 years? Is that most of y'all? Do y'all go to La Cantera? La Cantera is a little cooler than Ingram Mall, isn't it? I mean, if you had a choice between the two, I don't know why La Cantera does well. What's the one down on 410? The big one with the boot? North Star. Do y'all go to North Star? Why don't your generation like malls? My generation was all about malls. We spent our whole life in malls. We never bought anything. We spent our whole life sitting in malls for some reason.
E-commerce.
Is it e-commerce? Because you're still going out and shopping. When I go to these strip malls, I mean, their parking lots are packed, and then I say Ingram Mall, and you can park wherever you want to at Ingram Mall. Don't you wish UTSA parking was like Ingram Mall parking? Wouldn't that be nice? So Macy's, it's got a struggle, but then you look at JWN doing much better. 7 PE. Why is the market paying twice as much for Nordstrom's earnings as they're paying for Macy's? What's the stock market telling you? So Nordstrom's has Nordstrom's, was it Rack or whatever? I have a student that's doing Nordstrom's for my security analysis paper. She says better service, better selection. You know, so you got to look at those things. But why does the stock market hate Macy's? They don't love Nordstrom's, and 7 PE is not all that high. Nordstrom's another mall kind of focused stock. And then you compare that to Target. Target is a 17 PE. So you have to pay $17 for $1 earnings of Target, but you only have to pay $3 for Macy's. The market says Target's much better stock than Macy's. And then you go to Walmart. We'll talk about Walmart a little bit later. Why does Walmart have a 27? Now, we're going to talk later. There's two things going on here with PE ratios. Part of it is growth, but the other part of it's risk. The reason Walmart is so expensive isn't because they expect high growth, it's because it's a very low risk company. So there's a couple of things going on we'll have to talk about. Alphabet or Amazon. $109 PE. It's a pretty expensive stock. We can look at Zoom. What do you think Zoom is? High PE? Pretty high, but this is a stock that's come down a lot, hasn't it? Now, GameStop. I'm going to guess GameStop is going to say NA. Let's see. Why is their PE ratio NA? What's missing? They have a stock price, so it can't be the P. So what's missing? Earnings. What's your PE ratio if your earnings is negative? Can't calculate it. So can't do that one. Let's see. What do you think about IBM? How many of y'all are excited about IBM? The E of 20 is kind of high, isn't it? It's up there. They've got Watson. They got some AI going on. Y'all seen Watson on Jeopardy or whatever. But what is IBM? IBM is almost entirely a consulting firm now. They compete with Accenture. They used to be a big hardware company, sold hardware. We used to buy all of our PCs from IBM. We don't do that anymore. I mean USAA, don't do that anymore. I was like, so Facebook, Meta. Meta has a PE of 12. That's a really low PE ratio. So that puts them more as a value stock than a growth stock. Is Facebook, is Meta now a value stock? So I mean, that's what you're looking at. Why is Facebook so cheap? You can get Facebook for less than half what you have to pay for Walmart. Part of that's because Walmart's a low risk company and Meta's a higher risk company. But part of it is that the stock market has just given up on Facebook. Is that logical? It could be. Well, I'm trying to think of some exciting company. Moderna. I'm trying to remember. I was getting my M&R mix up. So Moderna, PE ratio 3. Pretty exciting stuff here. mRNA, there's a lot they can do with it, but why have they come off so much? They were at 384. What were they benefiting from there? Vaccines? Another pandemic? Are they hoping for a pandemic? They're not going to say that publicly, but COVID is not the only thing mRNA is useful for. They're finding other applications, but really cheap stock. I'm actually somewhat tempted to buy their stock because it's just so cheap. The market's expecting the earnings to keep coming down just because we're coming out of the pandemic. but they're still inventing stuff. So this is what you got to ask. So what would Moderna be, a growth or a value stock?
Well,
Definitely value. Low PE like that, definitely a value stock. Are all pharmaceuticals like that? Eli Lilly is a 50 PE. Why is that pharmaceutical trading at almost 50 times earnings? Or mRNA is only trading at 3. So, all right. So that's value versus growth. Right now, I'm somewhat over allocated to value. I've been over allocated value this whole year. How have they done? Well, you can see value outperforms for fairly long periods of time, but the last few years, you've seen growth really take off. Look at that difference there, growth versus value. So right here, people are thinking growth is the only place to be. It's always wins, but you can see over the long term, value has actually done pretty well. There's actually whole books written talking about why does value outperform. Unfortunately, they're usually written right about here. So, hey, you should be a value investor. But growth does have its periods of time. You go to long term, value tends to outperform by quite a bit. It shouldn't. These are lower quality, riskier companies. They tend to outperform even more than the risk would imply, but they do outperform. Now, you look at what happened here. What's going on right here? Growth outperformed here. What is this? That's the .com. How did that end up? You notice, look at value. You notice value hardly even noticed that stock market sell off. Hardly even a dip at all. So growth sold off dramatically there. So this is why I'm more. So I don't know if I got it right at the top, but definitely they both have come down, but growth has come down a whole lot more than value. So if we look at it, so those you can leave early next week from the investment society because this is what I wanted to show them. So what this is I take the PE ratio of the growth index and divide it by the PE ratio of the value index. So you saw that we saw one company is like a 25 PE and Macy's is like a 3. So you take 25 divided by 3. So if you look at here, here's the .com. Historically, value stocks versus growth stocks. Growth stocks, see that 1.41? Growth stocks have been about 41% more expensive than value stocks on a PE ratio. What did they do in the 2000? They were 3.83 times more expensive. Now I remember this because I actually did a presentation right here. I was taught you never say the word bubble. That's how I was taught in college. That's the first time in my career I used the word bubble. I was talking to the CEO of UTSA and I was like, NASDAQ looks ridiculously overpriced. I was trying to get him to buy put options on NASDAQ. I lost that argument. Boy, I wish I'd followed my sword on that one. Sometimes I was really right. I was really right, but being really right doesn't work if you don't get someone to actually execute the transaction. So I lost. But I just thought, man, this is so ridiculous. Right here, here's where we are. So growth stocks look pretty expensive, don't they? But not so much relative to that. But if we take that out, if we just look here recently, you can see growth stocks really sold off in the .com, but they're a lot more expensive than they have been. So if you look historically, right now, growth is trading at a 1.86 times value. Historically, it's been 1.41, so they are very expensive versus. So that's why I've stuck with the value. They're just really expensive right now, especially if interest rates rise. That's gonna really hurt the value stories. So if you take out the .com, the valuation is 139. So normally they're about 39% more expensive if you take out the .com. So that's why I would say value. So how do you buy value stocks? It's really simple. You just buy value ETF. We'll talk about later. They're all over the place. They're really easy to buy. Vanguard has value ETFs. Barclays, BlackRock. They're very easy. Value versus growth. Why did I use the Russell 3000? Well, the Russell 1000 is the large companies. So remember we talked about large, mid, and smalls. So the Russell 1000, they're right now trading 81% rich. Historically, they're usually about 42% rich. The 2000 are the small companies. And look at this PE ratio for small companies. The PE ratio for the Russell 2000 growth is at 1200. Something's going on with small company growth, small company growth. That's a pretty high number, isn't it? The normal is 2 times. The most recent is 28 times. So yeah, there's no reason to buy small cap growth right now. There's just something bizarre is going on with that index. The 3000, you combine the 1000 and the 2000, so it's just all stocks. And so I really love small cap value. I'm a huge fan of small cap value, so I've been pushing small cap value. But easy to buy. You could just do Vanguard small cap value and an ETF will come up. You can buy that ETF, and you'll be buying something that is trading right now at 28 PE versus the growth stocks are trading at 1200 PE. So you're getting something that looks pretty cheap. Actually, it jumped up here just recently. So there's stuff going on with small company stocks. Why? Because we're worried about a recession, so their earnings are getting crushed more than large cap. All right, so there's style. And some growth stocks stop being growth stocks, become value stocks. They can move around quite a bit. All right, what questions do you have on style? If we go to the style box, so this is the Fidelity Contra Fund. So you notice they have size up here and they have style down here. So how would you define the Fidelity Contra Fund? What are they doing? You had to say it in 3 words. What would you say? Are they small cap value? Someone yell it out. Large cap growth. Yeah, so if you're in an interview and say, yeah, I was looking at Fidelity Contra Fund, that's a large cap growth manager. Yeah, I mean, does that sound like an undergraduate student? It doesn't, but that's what you don't want to sound like an undergraduate student. How did Morningstar figure this out? They did it with statistics, regressions. They regressed this particular mutual fund against growth indices, value indices, large cap, small cap, and they said they got the highest correlation in that box right there. So it's a large cap growth manager. You can't tell it from the title because it says it's the Contra Fund. I don't know what the K6 means, but the Contra Fund, that kind of implies they buy value stocks, but then you run the analysis and see, no, they're actually a growth manager. So here's a Vanguard Small Cap Value Index Fund. What do you think it's going to show up on the box? Bottom left, top right, where is it going to be? You hope bottom left. Let's see. Yep, sure enough. And it's an index fund, so their R squared is probably 99.9999999. If not, then there's some problem with this fund. So yeah, so it's in the title. So if you want to do small cap value, there it is right there. How much would you pay? 7 basis points a year, almost for free. In fact, you'll get all that back in securities lending. So you're not gonna pay. It's gonna be you get a free mutual fund. So yeah, I mean, And we could do, okay, so they use the word value, blend, and growth. That's the wrong term in the middle. I think I told y'all what this middle term is. Y'all remember what this is? Blend is not the right term. So it should be value, core, and growth. Don't use the word blend. Morningstar, I don't know who works for them and they use the word blend. So if you're balanced between value and growth, it's called core. You have a core fund. So large cap core, large cap value, large cap growth. So if we do the Vanguard S&P 500 index fund, that should be large cap core, right in the middle. Okay, not value, not growth, it's right in the middle. Are y'all familiar with Morningstar? You'll probably see Morningstar in your careers. If any of y'all about to graduate, you really want to do financial planning, I have someone just send me an email looking for someone to come work for them. So if you're interested in the CFP, let me know. I can forward that over to you. All right. Let's get the US versus non-US. All right, so remember you want to define it and then you want to get the subcategories and talk about strategy. So US versus non-US, there's essentially 4 categories, maybe 5, depending on how you count it. So obviously you have US, we've already talked about US. The US, we talked about US large cap, US large cap growth. And then once we get outside the United States, we like to break that into 3 categories. So there's developed markets, emerging markets, and frontier markets. So developed markets, these are these large economies, very stable. They tend to have very stable currencies. They tend to have large GDP per capita. They have well-established, well-developed stock markets. So those are developed. Give me an example of a developed market that you could invest in. Be obvious. The UK would be one. So a large European countries would be developed markets. Canada would be one. South America, I don't think there's a single South American or Central American country that is developed.
You can lock down?
Huh?
You can lock down, like Latin America.
Can you?
You can Latin America, is there like?
I don't think there's any Latin American countries that are considered developed. Yeah, I don't think there's one. I can't think of Brazil is not. Venezuela, obviously not. Chile and Peru, you know, those are the ones that are the most advanced, but I don't think their stock markets are, we're talking about the stock markets really, but it's the countries. A lot of Europe is, Eastern Europe probably still isn't. Romania and those type of countries probably are not developed. Israel's developed. Yeah, Middle East. Israel might be the only Middle East, but there are some countries that are coming along. It's possible. We'd have to look, but there are some developed countries that don't necessarily have developed stock markets. So you might think like China. China is not a developed country from the stock market standpoint, although it's the second largest economy out there. But the reason not is because its stock market is a small fraction of their economy. And that's one of the things we look at. In the US, our stock market's a huge percentage of our economy. So that's one thing they look at. I'll show you the rules. So in Asia, you know, obviously Japan, Singapore, South Korea. So there are some definitely. Australia is developed and they're in Asia. So yeah, so there are some emerging markets. These are fast growing companies developing. They typically have high expected returns, although they haven't done very well here recently. Have higher economic growth, but they're risky. They do provide some diversification in your portfolio, but not as much as they've had in the past. If the US stock market crashes, these stock markets tend to crash alongside them. And then you have frontier markets. This is for the not faint of heart. These are really, really troubled countries. Their stock markets might have 2 stocks in them. The entire stock market might not even be $1 billion. We're talking really struggling countries. So we'll have to find the list here, but so here's how S&P talks about what is developed. So to be a developed market, you have to meet all of these criteria. You have to have a market capitalization more than $2.5 billion, which, you know, Apple's what, $2.5 trillion. So Apple's by itself is 1,000 larger than that. So they're not asking for much. Turnover has to be $1 billion. I don't know in the US what it is. I think just Apple by itself is more than $1 billion. Just how much trading is going on a daily basis, $1 billion. I've done a trade myself of $1 billion. So that's not a big number. So $1 billion is not much money. So, you know, so there's not much there. They look at the development ratio. What they're looking for there is how large is the stock market relative to the economy. If it's less than 5%, then there's just not much there. And then they say, okay, well, let's add some more. Well, they really need to be at least 15 billion. That's still not much. Settlement T+3 in the US, you can do T+0. So T+3 means you do the trade today and the cash shows up 3 days later. I did trades, you know, I retired 13 years ago. We were doing T+0 13 years ago. So they're just asking for T+3. The debt of the government has to be BB or better, BB plus or better. No hyperinflation. Obviously, that's an issue in some countries like Turkey and Brazil and places. No significant foreign ownership restrictions. That can be an issue in China, definitely. And a freely traded currency, that could be an issue for China. And then their per capita, GDP per capita has got to be at least 15,000. That one probably kicks a lot of countries out. Where I work in Costa Rica, the per capita in that area is like $500. People are living on $500 a year. You know, there's a lot of countries where the daily income is $1 or less. That's considered poverty. So, you know, where I work in Costa Rica, it's like $1.50 or not even that. So very, very poor. So you got to have at least 15,000. Could you survive on 15,000 in the United States? It'd be really, really tough, wouldn't it? Especially with real estate right now, it'd be tough. But those are the criteria that they have. I don't know where China's per capita GDP is now. I think they've gotten above that. They say 10,000. For 63,000. South Africa, 5,000. When you think about it, South Africa used to be much wealthier than China. And now you see that China is twice as wealthy as South Africa. So these things can change pretty dramatically. Vietnam, did I not spell it correctly? Oh, Vietnam, Africa. They're like, what are you asking? 2,700. So, but it has grown quite dramatically. There's the Philippines, Cambodia. Any countries y'all want to put in here?
Look at UAE. I've been recently.
Yeah, that's a wealthy country.
That's 43,000.
Yeah, but isn't Luxembourg? Isn't it the wealthiest country out there? So Luxembourg, not very big place. You know, just sitting there. Liechtenstein and Luxembourg. I don't know. I've always thought maybe I should move to Luxembourg, but I probably couldn't afford the houses there. But probably a pretty nice place, you would think. Right? Those poor souls only making 90,000 a year. It's like, oh man, how do you get by? My word. Huh?
I'm wondering what their economy.
Well, no telling. Yeah. But it's a really, really small place. So yeah, you know, it's so Monaco. You think so? Oh wow, 190. So, yeah, Monaco, they're not much of, there's not much space there either. So these, you're almost like cities. I don't know, compare that to Singapore. Singapore is real compared to the US. Singapore is another, if I ever visit Asia, I'll probably go to Singapore because I think I could get around with my English. It's a lot better than my Mandarin. Yeah, so they're, China is not that, they're the second biggest economy, but they're much, much poorer than the rest of the world. And that's one of the things I look at for a developed country. You gotta have some wealth there. Uganda, what do you think? Uganda? So, that's a $2 a day country. How do you survive on $2 a day? That's a very, very poor country. I don't know if it's the poorest country out there, but there's some poor countries out there. I don't, you do something like North Korea, I don't think you can even get the numbers. I don't know if they even report them. So we just don't know what they might be. So that's part of what we're doing. So see if we can find a good list. MSCI, let's see if they'll give it to us here. MSCI, so there's Standard & Poor's. They do a lot of indices. You've heard of the S&P 500. MSCI, y'all know what the MS stands for? Big investment bank. They're not part of it anymore. So it used to be Morgan Stanley Capital Indices, but then they sold it off. So I think it's an independent company, or maybe Moody's bought them or something. So let's look and see how they have this set up. Yep, they didn't show it to us. All right, here we go. It was right there. Can y'all see that? All right, so developed markets in the Americas, that's it, Canada, United States. I go to Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a fairly stable country, but it is not a high stock market. I don't even know what would be in their stock market. Europe, we got Australia, Belgium, all the ones you'd expect. Israel might be the only Middle East there. I think it is. Pacific, Australia, Hong Kong, Japan. It's interesting. Hong Kong's in there. New Zealand, see, Singapore is in there. Emerging, there are some America, but there's a lot of countries missing in emerging. Look at frontier markets. Boy, they don't even list on the Americas over there. So Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. You can see a lot of Eastern Europe when it comes to Europe, and in Asia. China is an emerging market. India, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, Philippines, Taiwan, Thailand, and in frontier markets. The only place Africa shows up is on the frontier markets, except for South Africa. South Africa is an emerging market. I don't think there's any other African countries here. Middle East, Bahrain, Jordan, Oman, Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Vietnam. So that's how they classify them. You know, I mean, there's what, 195 countries in the world. You notice a lot of them are missing. North Korea probably doesn't have a stock market. Where's Russia in here? You'll see Russia. I don't know if they're Europe or Asia. I don't see Russia at all. Botswana's in there. Where's Botswana? So they actually have a Botswana in Zimbabwe. Russia's there on a standalone. So they have standalone indices. If you want to invest in Russia, you can get your own indice just for Russia. I like the standalone indices, not that I would want to invest specifically in Russia, but then it gives me a list of all the stocks. You want to know what stocks are actually in Russia, what industries are they in, you can certainly do that. So that's what you're looking for. So which of these frontier markets would you want to be in? I find Eastern Europe quite exciting and interesting. I'd be watching politics real closely. You know, a new leader comes in, that's pretty interesting. In Africa, oh my word, in Africa, maybe Morocco. I don't know, boy, Nigeria maybe. Tanzania has just had a disaster. Why is Egypt not up there? Where's Egypt? Can y'all find Egypt in here?
It's on,
Is it over here?
Yeah, it's on
All right, so Egypt emerging. Are they the only besides South Africa? Okay, so Egypt and South Africa are in there. You got Kuwait in the Middle East in there, and Turkey, United Arab. So there are some Middle East. So that's how they classify them. Is it, is it bad for these countries that they're not on there? If I were leading these countries, and if I were President Xi in China, I'd be curious, what are these criteria? Why aren't we a developed market? What could we do to become a developed market? I think I'd be looking at that just out of curiosity, not that you have to let Standard & Poor's dominate how you try to manage your country, but it does give you some insights there. My guess is China, I think they, it looks like they're still under on 15,000. I don't think their foreign currency would fit here. There are definite ownership restrictions there, but then Hong Kong is in the list. When will that change? How long will that change? And what happens to Taiwan if China attacks Taiwan in this list? So, you've got some concerns as an investor. So here's how they've done. So Jack Bogle said, don't bother investing overseas. And you would have been smart to have listened to them, because developed and emerging markets have not done well at all. It's been pretty, I don't think I updated this. I should update this. I need to go and update it. I updated a small cap and the growth and value, but I haven't updated these in a while. So, but yeah, international has just not done well at all. The US sold off more than the rest of the world in COVID, but it also recovered much better. So the US got back to where it started, but this is all 2020. So I need to update this and show you all the newer numbers. Now, Jack Bogle's argument is you don't need to buy European stocks and Asian stocks. You just buy US companies that are global and you get the same thing. So buy Exxon, you've got the whole world. Buy Coca-Cola, buy McDonald's, you're getting the whole world. Most people disagree with him on that. In fact, Vanguard disagrees with him on that, even though he founded Vanguard. But he was just never a big fan of non-US stocks. And he was very, very right for the longest time. Non-US stocks have just not been the place to be. The only time they did well was in the 70s and 80s when Japan took over. And when Japan had that incredible run where their economy just really took over the world. But when Japan blew up and hasn't really come back, nothing, Europe is just not an exciting place to be an investor. You think about Europe, why aren't there Facebooks and Googles and Microsofts and Teslas? Why don't those firms exist in Europe? Those big firms in Europe are 50, 100 years old. Can you think of a massive firm in Europe that's 10 years old, 20 years old, like a Facebook? It just doesn't exist. What's the problem? Why are there so many firms in Europe that have 49 employees? Because once you hire that 50th employee, you have no control over your workforce. You can never fire them. It's a horrible place to do business. And that's why it frustrates me about Costa Rica. Costa Rica, their government regulations are so horrendous. We started a restaurant, and it's just ridiculous what we have to go through to do anything. And so let me show you this chart here. So this is a really interesting, this is the World Bank. They do something called the ease of doing business. Number 1 is New Zealand, then Singapore, Hong Kong, Denmark, South Korea, and the US is number 6. We rank really, really high there. Wow, kind of interesting. Georgia's up there. United Kingdom, Norway, Sweden, Lithuania. You go down to the bottom, Somalia, Eritrea, Venezuela. Any of y'all want to invest in Venezuela? Well, where does I write his name? Maduro. If Maduro gets kicked out, it could be the perfect time to be in Venezuela. They can't get much worse, can they? And certainly oil prices are helping them. Yemen, Libya, South Sudan. Any of y'all want to invest in South Sudan? My sister-in-law goes there She's a pediatrician. She goes there on medical journeys. She's in a Jeep where they have to run and hide under the cliff so they don't get bombed. That's not a good place. You know, if you got a civil war going on, that's not going to be a good place for business. It's obviously not a good place for children. So you can see the ones here in the end of it. Does that mean you avoid these? What you're looking for here, you know, Miramar, what a disaster. But what if the military, they throw in the towel and they go back and have some democracy? You know, turnaround stories is where you can make a fortune in these countries. But you have to know their history. This is the reason I listen to The Economist every single week. I don't know how many of y'all listen to The Economist, but they go around the entire world and they tell you what's going on in Peru, what's going on in Myanmar, what's going on in Malaysia. You know, they tell you all these countries. Comoros, have y'all been there before? Really small island. It's probably pretty, but it doesn't have a great economies. But I don't know what's going on there. But how many people in the world do know what's going on there? So you can be an expertise. You can go study that, figure out what's going on, and you may figure out right when you should invest. I was listening to a really good podcast where his country of choice was Iraq. Does Iraq sound like a country you want to invest in? But he said, no, there's a lot of exciting things going on in Iraq. He was finding really good investment opportunities. Well, okay. You get kind of in the middle here. There's my Costa Rica, ranked 74th. I don't know where Russia is in here. So Russia's the one where Putin looked at this list and he found artificial ways to get his country ranked higher. He didn't make changes, he just reported changes so they could move up the list. So there he is. Hey, there's France right there, 32nd. If you wanted to move France up the list, what would you have to do? So what you can do down here below, actually here they show you how their ranking goes against other indices. But what they do here is they show you what goes into their scoring. How easy is it to start a new business? So here's their list of the 10 economies improving the most. That gets me excited as an investor. So an investor is not looking for great stories because great stories are expensive. Investors are looking for turnaround stories. That gets me most excited. I want something that's a disaster that's about to get fixed, because that's where you can make, you don't make 10% in those stories, you make 5,000% in those stories. They're really exciting. Dealing with construction permits. How long does it take you to get a construction permit in the United States? In Costa Rica, it's forever. Why? Because the people, and this is a big part of it, the people who approve construction permits have no incentive to do it fast. They're not paid more if they do their jobs well. Very frustrating, isn't it? But if you're the president of Costa Rica, what would you do? How can we fix that? Why does it take you 6 months to approve something that should take you 3 days? If I were the president of Costa Rica, that would be my focus. How long does it take you to get electricity? It take forever. Now in Costa Rica, it's amazing. We have one of our microloans is their local water company. And Pino runs it, and Pino, boy, funny guy. I wish I could understand his jokes because they're all in Spanish. I don't understand jokes in Spanish. But he tells the funniest, I know they're funny because everybody's doubled over laughing every time he talks. But boy, he takes that seriously. He makes sure you get water. He makes sure it comes on time. He makes sure if anything happens. Why does he get paid more if he does a good job? He actually doesn't. He just takes a lot of pride in what he's doing. He's going to make it. So you just got the right person in place. Registering property, getting credit. How hard is it to get credit? Borrow money. Protecting minority investors. There's some countries that, boy, they take care of certain investors and they just rip off the others. Paying taxes, trading across borders, enforcing contracts, that can be really important. Resolving insolvency, that's been a huge issue in Japan and India, places where you just can't go out of business. In the US, you can go out of business. Say, sorry, we messed up, we're bankrupt, take what you can get. There's people who've gone out of business 6 times and they're now starting their 9th or 10th business and they're making a fortune. I love that about the United States. I love it that you can mess up and try again and mess up, and the 7th time you get it right and you become a billionaire. That's really exciting. In some countries, you mess up once and you're marked for life. So, that's the kind of things they're looking at. So you as an investor, you're not just looking for countries that do this well, you're looking for countries that are starting to get better at this. So they're saying Saudi Arabia, kind of questionable, but the new prince, he's letting people go to theaters and letting women drive cars. There's some interesting things going on, but he's also assassinating people, maybe, who knows? I don't know the inside story on that. No, you get the good and the bad. Who knows? Nigeria, Africa has a young population, a lot of resources, but horrible infrastructure. It's hard to get from one place to the next. I think Nigeria has a coastline, right? So they have access to trade routes. That's important. But if it takes you 4 hours to get from the middle of the country to the ocean, that's not good. So you got to build roads. But that's exciting. There's a lot of wealth in Nigeria. You look at is it Chad, or what's the country with all the all the stuff you need for electronic vehicles, and they've got resources if they can just figure out the infrastructure and get it to work. So there's a lot of wealth there. So what country in Africa is going to get it right? And that's the one you want to invest in. So those kind of things. So you got Togo in there, that's Bahrain. So you got Africa, Middle East, Eastern Europe, Asia, Middle East, China's in there. That's interesting. Asia, Africa, Jordan, Middle East. I don't know why Jordan's in there. That's kind of interesting. But could you use this as an investor to figure out where you want to invest? You certainly could. The issue is what Putin did is, are they actually getting better at this? Or are they just reporting that they're getting better at this? So you're somewhat at their mercy. So I would want to know, are they really doing it? That's why I think this is an area where, if I were your age, I'd be really tempted. I don't know if I want to move to Tajikistan or not. Probably too cold for me, but you move to a country, learn its language, learn its economy, learn its politics. If there's something there, you now become a very wealthy person because you're now the go-to person. But you got 195 countries to pick from. You got to pick the one that's going to turn itself around. How good are you going to do that? Are you willing to commit that kind of resources? But these are the kind of things you can read. This is a really good document, isn't it? It gives you some great insights on where you might have some opportunities to invest. If you have language skills and you know some of these countries, Mandarin's are really obviously a really important one. Spanish is a really important one. If you have those languages, I'm getting a lot of students that are fluent in Spanish that are getting hired because, in fact, Valero just sent me a job where the person had to be fluent in Spanish to be able to do it because they were doing a project in Mexico. So language skills can really help you out. There's a lot of opportunities here if you really want to concentrate and focus. Maybe you don't focus just on Botswana. Maybe you just focus on Southern Africa. So you got Botswana, you got Angola. I don't know how far north you go. Maybe you learn that whole area. I don't know how many languages that is, how many different politics. It can get pretty complicated. But if you focus in it, you can learn stuff that no one else in the world knows. Productivity. Where's productivity improving the most in the world? You can see in the United States, we've been having tough time getting up to 2%. So it's really, really tough. You can see this is what President Obama was talking about. Why is our productivity coming down so much? He left office right here. So, it's just, he had 3%, but it's just really, really rough. All right, so one last thing, to think about is this one, and that's the education side. I do think this is key. So I find it interesting in Africa that there's some of these charitable groups that are doing like private schools that are having some pretty good success. There's a good Economist article on that. Certain countries, if you don't have an educated workforce, it doesn't matter how young they are, they're just not going to be very productive. So where does productivity come from? It comes from the skills of the workers and the capital the country has. And so what are the best educated places out there? So Singapore is at the top, Hong Kong, a lot of Asian countries. So there's Singapore and Netherlands. You got some of the Scandinavian countries. Estonia is in there for some reason. Canada. Here's the United States on math. We've done much better on reading. We're coming up on reading. Science I don't see how we're good at science. I never had one good science class. And did y'all have good science classes? How's your chemistry? H2O, y'all remember H2O? So I had horrible science teachers. Oh my word, they're terrible. But I had great English teachers. I had all good math teachers, but so STEM is important. And we hire a lot of people from overseas because they have better education overseas. In some countries, the public schools are horrendous, but the private schools are really good. I know I have students from certain countries that come to UTSA and they all went to private school. They say, yeah, you cannot get an education from the public schools. So, you have to, how do you fix this problem? So there's been a lot of questions about why do some of these countries do so well? So I mentioned Singapore. I read a really interesting book on Singapore, and they made the argument it's not as good as it looks because the kids are just way too stressed out. They're essentially adults their entire lives because they never get a chance to be a kid. That's not good. And then you have countries like Denmark and Finland, where the kids are really happy. They're out skipping in the fields with the flowers, and they're getting a really good education. No homework to take home. What's that model? Those books written about this. What's going to happen in the United States? I don't think there's anything going on right now that's radically going to change the United States, but we certainly need that. So I think this is pretty critical. The ease of doing business, the educational system, those are all important. You could throw all of that out, developed, emerging, frontier, and you could just say, you know what, let's find a better way to combine this. So instead of thinking US and develop and emerging, let's just think global. So let's just look at the world. So let's look at global large cap. Let's look at global large cap growth stocks. We don't care if they're in the United States or in Canada or in Europe. We don't care. We're just looking global. So, and you could say focus on capitalization. You could focus on value versus growth, but just do global. Some people said, well, sometimes global makes sense, but sometimes local makes sense. So some industries like energy are global. So when you're looking at energy, who cares if it's Exxon or British Petroleum? It's energy. So just buy energy stocks. But if you're looking at restaurants or consumer services, then yeah, it matters whether they're in the United States or Canada or Europe, because you're really impacted by how many consumers are there and those kind of things. So what are you going to look for? You look for some combination. So maybe you split the world up by sectors, and some sectors are global. Some sectors you use the US, developed, emerging, those kind of things. There are some very, very prominent firms that are in emerging countries. So Brazil has, is it Embraer, right? Embraer, is that how you pronounce it? Produces planes. That's a very global, very well-known firm. So, there are some countries that are not on the list at all as far as developed, but they definitely have very well recognized companies. So that there may be a trend. I think what I've shown you is the more likely trend: US, developed, emerging, and frontier. One thing you need to know is the difference between global and international. Anybody have any guesses the difference? So you find a mutual fund that's a global stock fund. And you see another fund. If you go out to Vanguard, they have global stock funds and they have international stock funds. What do you think is the difference? So global is the entire world, including what? The US. So what do you think international is? Our world without the US. So that's the key. Global, it means the US is in there. International means there's no US stocks in there. Most people don't do global because they want to control how much they have in US versus non-US. So most people will probably do, now international includes developed, emerging, and frontier, but you can definitely find developed market funds and emerging market funds. You can probably even find emerging market funds, frontier market funds. They're probably all out there. So when you see the word global, it includes the US. When you see the word international, it does not include the US. All right, there's a lot of resources. I want to talk about some of these, but there's a lot of resources out there that talk about the US versus non-US and how you think about it. It really does come down to growth and productivity. That's what you're really after. You want the countries whose productivity is very, very strong. That's going to be highly dependent on capital, on government regulations, on innovation, on education, immigration, those kind of things. So I'll walk you through a few of these in the next class.